I'm Michael Kimmelman, chief art critic for the New York Times. Recently, art has been in the headlines. In New York, some of the shows attracting considerable attention include a major Thomas Eakins survey at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and a long overdue retrospective of the best second-generation New York School painter, Joan Mitchell's, at the Whitney Museum of American Art. In addition, the Museum of Modern Art has opened a new temporary space in Queens. And earlier this month, a Michelangelo drawing turned up in the attic of the Cooper Hewitt Museum. Joining me now to talk about these stories and more are Robert Storr, Senior Curator of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art, and soon-to-be Professor at the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. Peter Schjeldahl, Art Critic for The New Yorker, Art Critic for New York Magazine, Mark Stevens, and artist Elizabeth Murray. Welcome. Joan Mitchell. Rob, tell us a little bit about Joan Mitchell. Who is she?
Well, you defined her as being the best of the second generation of the New York School, and I know that she was always uncomfortable with the designation second generation, and also in a funny way she was of and also not of the New York School. The sort of discovery for her of what gestural painting could do was the key moment for her in every possible way. But she actually came from someplace else, Chicago, and she lived most of her life someplace else, which was in France. And what's interesting is how that discovery ignited in her a certain set of possibilities in paintings, which she then essentially developed in isolation. She showed here at Forcade and other galleries occasionally. She was back and forth and had context, but this is the work of somebody who essentially cultivated what de Kooning called her own yogurt in solitude for many, many, many years, and made these marvelous pictures, which are basically all about the sort of the explosions that happen when paint brushes meet and paint strokes meet and colors meet and so on. It's a very consistent vocabulary out of which very amazing things happen. Consistent vocabulary, do you mean that she didn't change that much over time? She changed her way of working somewhat, and she addressed herself to a certain set of issues. You can see it in the work, but basically the dynamics of the work don't change. Her early paintings are made, in a sense, without a form to draw. So unlike de Kooning, who was a very important artist for her, or even Pollock for that matter, she wasn't pushing off of some kind of an image or an automatic kind of a gesture in her hand. And later on you can see her looking at Rothko and other people and thinking about big open spaces, but then as soon as she creates a sort of Rothko-like veil of color, then she piles on all this very rich, marked paint, which does the opposite of what Rothko does, which is to dissolve the surface of the canvas. And so she's in dialogue with other artists, but it's always that impulse to sort of make the mark, twist the brush, roll it, make color, smear, and see what happens. And then sometimes the pyrotechnics produce this sort of wonderful, moody color, and sometimes just brilliant, brilliant, brilliant color. Color, Mark, you mentioned when you wrote about this show, Monet is somebody who comes up often in Joan Mitchell's discussions. She was in France a while. Is Monet an important figure for her?
Well, she lived in Giverny. She was always a little uncomfortable, as with the second generation term, about being likened to Monet. She didn't really like very much being likened to his watercolors paintings, his water lily paintings. But in Salut Tom, her famous painting that I think we have...
Maybe we can see that, actually. I think we have that. Salut Tom.
This was done after Tom Hess died, and it is very much an homage both to Hess, I think, and also to the water lily paintings. You can see that the space has a kind of summer pond feeling about it. But the thing that I just loved about this show is that her joy in the paint swoons, the absolute rapture in the medium, the pleasure she takes in painting, which is becoming so rare. Pleasure, is maybe the most radical thing that you can try to do in art today. And her show was one of that really celebrates pleasure in all its forms in painting.
Joan didn't like being described as anything, and second generation or Monet-like, and I think both terms are apt, actually, historically. And that I think there was a show I recently saw in Switzerland of the heritage of Monet, and it was a terrible show, and which made no sense at all, except that Joan Mitchell and Monet just sort of stepped out for coffee together. It was, and I think it has to do with presenting paint as paint in a way that is referential.
What do you mean by that?
Well, that it evokes the color evokes the gesture evokes, the density evokes.
The paint itself is a conveyor of meaning.
Yeah, and it's, but whereas, Monet played recognizable melodies, Joan Mitchell, like Elizabeth Murray, another artist I can think of, was more a jazz saxophonist, where you know the melody is there, but you can't peg it.
Well, would you like to do a riff on Elizabeth on Joan Mitchell? Has she been somebody who's been important to you?
When I was a student, I didn't even know who she was in the early 60s in Chicago. I didn't see her work till I came here in '67.
That had a lot to do with the way she was sort of written out, I suppose, of American
I think that
art.
in a sense at that point, it wasn't so much that she was written out, it was just that the men were so powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And I really sympathize enormously with her feeling, even though I agree with what you say, like about her and Monet, with both of you. It's true, you feel it. Maybe more Van Gogh. She was her own person so much. She was such an individual, and she took what she needed from Pollock and de Kooning and Rothko, and then she went her own way so totally and so utterly passionately and beautifully. And you feel this. I mean, I learned so much from de Kooning, and I learned how to paint from looking at his paintings in Chicago. And you just feel her. You said rapture, and I think that's true. The other part of her painting for me, though, which I really identify with, is how you can make something so beautiful and so angry at the same time.
In what ways are they angry?
I think that the way the strokes and the splotches slash and pile and go this way and that way, she's got her whole self in there, and she isn't holding back. And I love that about her work, and I think it's something you kind of sense right away, even in the bad ones. That she just puts it all out there, as she did as an individual, I guess.
There's legion stories about her, aren't there?
Right. There are many, many stories about her.
You have an image from the 60s, I think, which is a very angry period
That's
for her.
right. There's an untitled work from the 60s as well.
But there's, not that Pollock didn't, the guys were angry too.
Right.
And I've always felt a certain amount of poignancy with her, that she came up at a time where I think that women felt they had to behave and protect themselves in certain ways.
Of course, this was another term she hated as well, being considered a woman artist.
Really hated
women
that.
artists in general was not a term she was...
A lady artist, you would call them. She was no lady.
She hated the weather report, though. and it's interesting. I mean, that some of the paintings that she described as her angriest, most depressed periods have come across as pure lyricism. So it's, I think Eliot's the artist, the man who suffers and the artist that creates. She was the real article. I mean, she was like a real artist in some fundamental way, and it's knowing about her personality really doesn't help you with the art. I mean, it almost heads you in the wrong direction.
It's interesting. The late pictures, some of them in which she was as irascible as ever in person, are some of the most ecstatic paintings, clearly painted in the 80s. They're filled with light. Maybe we could look at some of those last ones, like Faded Air, which was from '85. To me, they also look like they're just buoyant pictures, almost like
Dionysian.
Yeah. And I wonder, today what kind of especially for younger artists, what kind of a signal Mitchell sends? Here she is, this painter, just sort of out there and doing these ecstatically beautiful pictures. Is she a painter for this moment in some interesting way?
Well, I think she's an unknown country to a lot of artists, and I think the show should be important in that respect, because it'll give them, or some people anyway, the courage just to sort of go at it, hammer and tongs, and see what happens. And there have always been people in the art world who have been close to her individually and who were friends of hers. She was very good at collecting and buttressing younger artists. But to be able to do that absent Joan herself maybe is the better way. It's where you can, again, deal with the artist and not with the personality. I think that'll give people a lot to think about. And painting is in perfectly good shape at the moment, but its mood is bad.
What do you
Mitchell...
mean by that?
Well, it's self-conscious about its situation relative to other art forms. It's mistrustful of a lot of its histories, which has produced interesting art in certain cases. I'm just saying, somebody who believes that emphatically in what is possible with brush and colors could be a great tonic.
Nothing ironic or ambiguous or cynical.
I think that she comes along at a very historically specific moment. I don't think she's really possible 5 years before or 5 years after. You know, it's like, it's at the moment of the absolute peak of painting in modern art prestige, you know, and she takes from around her and she backs up a little. She doesn't, I mean, she's the one second generation painter who really looks at Gorky, I think, you know, like who de Kooning looked at, right? So she backs up for a run and then sails off into space. But it was possible to be to wake up in the morning and pick up a brush and feel like the world was looking over your shoulder, and that is not the case today.
What's shocking about her, I think, to young artists would be the absence exactly of irony, or the courage not to fall back upon irony, and her just really exposing herself. She is such a naked painter, and I think people today, as Rob is saying, painters today, there's something shameful about painting in the current art world context. You have to apologize almost for doing it and say, well, I'm smart too. I know about irony. I know what transgressive means. I went to graduate school. And so there's all these efforts to filters that people apply to painting, which can be sensational and fabulous. But what's so different about this is that she wanted to get to something that had nothing to do with filters.
That's always been true with American artists. I mean, from the very beginning, American artists have felt they have to, like, go to Europe to study, understand something intellectual, explain what they're doing. It's not anything new, and it's almost until the abstract expressionists and then the pop artists. It's almost as though there's been this kind of regression where younger painters, many of them feel they have to have this kind of subtext for it to be okay just to paint. I mean, I don't know what will happen with younger people going to see this show if they'll say, oh wow, I can just do this. I can really throw myself into it and I don't have to explain it to anybody.
You bring up American artists, a long tradition of going to Europe, so that brings up Thomas Eakins, conveniently, who went to Europe for a few years. He was studying in Paris, but he came back and became probably the quintessential American painter. And it's interesting, when he went to Europe, he had gone there because his father had bought him out of going into the Civil War. I've always thought that on some level, Eakins' whole desire to become a very American artist was, in a way, paying back the country for the gift of not having had to serve in the war. And, you know, he comes back and he paints these very American paintings, sculling figures, modern, you know, it'd be like someone suddenly painting baseball or basketball players. Is Eakins, in some ways, an interesting figure right now for us, or is this show, which is so large and interesting on its own, just a historical event?
I think it's very interesting right now. I mean, I saw it in Philadelphia and wrote about it soon after September 11th. And actually, I had 2 long paragraphs about the connection, which came out in the editing.
Here's your shot.
But it's, the Americanness of someone who went to Europe and at a time of avant-garde breakthrough and Manet and Impressionism, didn't look at that stuff at all, studied with the old warhorse academicians, you know, imbibed that highly conservative, you know, technical grounding, came back and subjected it to American scientific and technological know-how. I mean, he leapt from pre-modern to what I hate to call postmodern, you know, without any problem. I mean, Americans at that time, and still to this day, I mean, don't have problems with traditions, partly because, you know, we're ignorant of them. But it's this sort of absolute sort of barbarous sophistication that he has, and, you know, and embraces science and photography and sexual freedom, you know, and and wants to be regarded above all as a professional.
Yeah. He painted, of course, this amazing picture of the Gross Clinic, which I think we have a picture of. I don't really know whether there is a more interesting picture painted in America in the 19th century, among other reasons because it is still such a shocking thing to look at. But it was a perfect example of him trying to sort of elevate this idea of science, American science, this physician practicing, as realistically as possible, despite the cringing woman, the only female in the image. She's cringing, probably the mother of that poor boy.
It's the giveaway. It is supposed to be the mother, I think.
Yeah.
It's also a portrait of the artist, though, you see. It's not just a...
In the background,
yes.
yeah.
He's holding a scalpel that has red paint on it, or blood.
Well, Eakins had gone to Spain. He'd seen Velázquez, so there's his little allusion to Velázquez Las Meninas. But why is this picture interesting? Do you think it is, or is it just...
I think it's a fascinating
Tell me why,
painting.
Elizabeth.
Except for the cringing mom, which is shocking when you realize what's going on in there. Like that's like the B-movie part of this incredible painting. It's so scary. Like all you see of the patient is the buttock. It's this hunk of fleshy, awful-looking leg with socks on. I mean, I don't think that it's probably the first moment in American painting that socks were painted. But the composition is completely predictable. It is all about light and dark and the sepia. There's nothing, absolutely nothing. It's total tradition. And yet it's absolutely eerily like the movies, like totally gets to you instantly. And the painting actually I thought of was like the difference between this and the Rembrandt autopsy painting, with a cold look on the faces of the doctors, and the patient is like this Jesus Christ figure. He's a criminal who's dead, and he looks so beautiful. And the light is falling on him, and he's done it in exactly the opposite way. I think it's a really brilliant painting.
Yeah, Rob.
I would say, in fairness to Eakins, the Agnew Clinic, which is a later painting of a similar subject, has a nurse staring unflinchingly down at a breast operation, which is likewise depicted without any, camouflage at all. And I think what's interesting about Eakins is that he really is a realist. I mean, he doesn't have ideas about things. He looks at what they are and what they tell you about what they are, which makes him one of the great painters of women. The portraits of women that he painted and the sense of the melancholy and the self-possession of these women is really amazing. He's one of the great painters of the nude, and whatever codings one might find there, what homoeroticism or lack of it there might be in the male nudes, what sort of reserve there are in the female nudes, it's the frankest portrait of naked Americans we'd had ever seen by that time, and still remains among the frankest.
He's also such an elusive painter, because although he is a realist, those late portraits they're Jamesian. He becomes an expatriate
Perhaps
almost.
we should look at the one of his wife, a late portrait of his wife near his death. It's a very beautiful portrait, and just as Rob says, intensely, but not just respectful, but just real.
I mean, such lush middle-aged melancholy. I mean, it's,
again,
not
intelligence that's right.
Applied to a female subject.
I mean, there's a thing that Kooning said was that the oil paint was invented for the sake of flesh, and in Eakins you see that put to a very funny test, because the sort of stringency of his painting takes away most of what we would think of as painterly painting, except in small pieces you see this amazing responsiveness to the material that does tell you what those bodies are like. But it's a kind of sensuality battened down by Philadelphia sensibility, academic training, and the reticences of the time.
I mean, you can see such lives unfulfilled and desires unexpressed in his faces.
There's a
his
lot
portraits.
of repression.
Well, and indeed sexual repression, isn't there? Maybe we could take a look at the photograph of the male nudes at the site of the swimming hole. This was, of course, became one of the photographs he used for a painting that shocked people at the time, partly because these were clearly not the painting in its final form. These were not just classical figures, and these were specific people, nude boys, and Eakins himself swimming towards them. And so everyone knew very clearly that there was something going on in this picture, even if at that time they didn't identify it as sexual desire or homosexual desire. But I'm sorry, I interrupted. You were saying about...
Oh, I was just thinking when I was going through the show that, especially with these photographs, which were shocking because I'd never seen or knew that he did this, there was a lot of flesh and a lot of, I mean, this is a very sexy picture. It's a turn-on picture. And the painting doesn't feel that way at all. The painting shows the genitals, but it's definitely posed, and all the verticals, horizontals, and the different poses, and it's very stiff.
There's an amazing photograph in the show. Did you notice the one where he's naked, carrying a naked woman in his arms?
Absolutely wild.
Falling down.
Yes, staggering.
But well, and of course he lost his job at the academy when before a life class he was had a nude male, a male model wearing a loincloth as was required, and in terms of describing the body, he took off the loincloth and threw it away, and there were girls and.
Wasn't the only time apparently this had happened.
Yeah, well, this is probably a favorite stunt of his. But.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting subject. It's hard to explore in this show, but the sort of latent homoerotic element in some of his paintings, and also his whole life. We saw that painting of his wife. There was also another portrait we did of his wife's companion, which was equally sensitive. Lived with him at the end of his life, and then stayed with Eakins' wife until the end of her life, many years later. And so there was clearly something going on in that house which was unconventional.
But if you look at it with contemporary eyes, I mean, one of the sort of basic tenets of postmodernist thinking is that, in fact, the idea of binary sexuality just doesn't make sense. The sexuality is a continuum, and without knowing anything about what Eakins did or liked to do, he presents a world where sexuality permeates everything, and positions are multiple.
Right.
Well, I don't think you have to go any farther than to say that he was a great friend and devotee of Walt Whitman, and I mean, the idea of trying to take Whitman's sexual inventory is just so boring, and I think we should extend the same attitude to Eakins.
A little respect for Eakins. Let's move on to something else that's happened, which is the discovery of a Michelangelo drawing in the attic. Why is everyone, or is this self-evident, why is everyone so thrilled when a Michelangelo or something else turns up? And is it because we all dream that in our attic there's some...
Well, it's the ultimate Antiques Roadshow moment, right?
You said you liked the drawing when we were talking earlier.
Actually, I was thinking of eBay just now. But,
the ultimate eBay moment.
No, I like the drawing. It's clearly a beautiful drawing. I just saw the newspaper, but it's basically just a vase with some lion feet. It's not one of his great drawings by any means at all, and the fuss that's made over it, to me, it's about the power of tradition and the name Michelangelo that everybody knows, and so they can, think this is this great art discovery, and it's a little annoying, actually.
I thought it was nice that it was found in a box called light fixtures. That's a light.
It's a big candlestick, actually.
It's also an episode in the one-upsmanships of scholars, because this is great sport when somebody from out of town discovers something that's right in front of your nose.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's a little incident of New York history. It's not a great art fact.
Another one turned up about 25 years ago, so it's obviously not the most unknown thing that Michelangelo drawing seemed to turn up, although that previous one had been associated with him before. But
these are the oldest chestnuts in the press. I mean, it's the story of finding the lost work in the attic that appears on a regular basis, and so does the new auction record. As with the Rubens, I mean, there's always, it's like your time in a mile. I mean, you go by increments, and everyone gets very excited, but no one ever remembers.
Sold for about $75 million in an auction in London. That's what you're referring to.
Right.
Yeah.
People express shock. I don't really understand why. I mean, if you can pay a CEO $100 million, and you can pay Mr. Rubens 75.
I think Peter once said about the 1980s, when there was all the speculative stuff in the market and all the press about it, that the 80s was about the sex life of money. And in a funny kind of way, I think this is transposed to the world of more genteel connoisseurship, but it's basically the same.
Money married art, and art. Money gave art sexiness, and art gave money class, and they had sex in public.
Yeah, I mean, from a newspaper person's perspective, it always has to do with uncovering. It's always a news thing. It's uncovering things or something quantifiable. If you can assign art a value, literally, then it's a lot easier than having to describe what that value is. So if the value is $75 million, that sounds pretty good.
And I don't really have any problem with that. I think we are talking about values, and
Well, the problem with it might be, this is by way of a question, that when that romance dies, when the stock market collapses and no one's going to pay that same amount of money.
Very depressing, yeah.
Yeah, it's very depressing. But is it also true then that the general public, which may have become interested in art because of the relationship with money and glamour, then suddenly thinks that art isn't as interesting anymore?
Well, I think they're probably right. I mean, I think what happens is that, you know, during these booms, I mean, art gets overvalued like anything. I mean, the thing about money is that people make a mistake of thinking that art is a commodity, you know, which it's not. I mean, like, you know, corn and oats and pork bellies are commodities, right? And I mean, art is really like money. You know, it's a thing. You know, it's a flat surface with a design on it that has absolutely no inherent value at all. It's entirely assigned. It's entirely subjective. And you know, to say that, you know, one piece of dirty canvas is worth so many pieces of green paper, you know, is a very interesting game, and it's very abstract, and people understand the structure of it, and it's a lot of fun.
I mean, one of the nice things, there are many nice things about collecting for museums, but one of the nice things about buying works of art is you take them out of circulation. They revert to being a thing to look at. And unless they're repackaged in shows or in other ways that make them overvalued for the wrong reason, all that happens is that ordinary people get to walk into galleries and look at these pictures and make up their minds about them. That's it.
Perhaps it would be useful if art were left more alone, too. And there weren't this hullabaloo.
Well, speaking of repackaging museums, at your museum, Rob, the Museum of Modern Art has moved out from Midtown to Queens, of all places, and it's going to be there for a few years while the museum builds some gigantic thing in the middle of the block. Maybe you could just quickly tell me what it is that's happening in Queens.
Well, we've in some ways transistorized the museum on 53rd Street in order to keep it going and running, and to make sure that it has a sort of a constant program of new exhibitions, and also that classics of the museum are on view for people who come from great distances, or also for our regular audience of people who just come, you know, periodically to see certain works of art. And there will be a full exhibition program there with major shows of Picasso and Matisse, of Max Beckmann, an exhibition of Dieter Roth, an under-known Swiss-German artist. And it'll be a fairly lively fair, and the real test will be whether Manhattanites can make it to Queens. I have much more faith in people from the other boroughs and from abroad. But in any case, that's basically, you know, to create a living place where the museum operates while we build this big building, and that we move back into it as a museum that's active in the field rather than as a museum that hibernated for a period of time.
Now I will recuse you from having to. Let's actually say what this museum is like. Have you? I assume you've all seen it. Have you been there yet, Elizabeth?
I haven't been there yet.
So, Peter, well, what is this new place in Queens?
It's a great big, I hate to say postmodern space. I hate that term. And by the way, the sort of logo mania is MoMA QNS, and if you say it quick, it's MoMAquins, and which actually fits the tone of it, which is very youth oriented. I think that MoMA and like the Guggenheim, like a lot of museums have realized that their future depends on being hangout spots for rich kids, you know, and yuppies, and it's very yuppie friendly, and lots of video projections, and it's and then of course it's got some of the masterpieces of painting arrayed on very big cold walls to show just how tough they are. I think, you know, it's Starry Night, you know, does crawl out, you know, get up off the canvas at the end, you know, and it's headlined, by the way, the section from the permanent collection, to be looked at, right? It's like, oh, what a concept. I mean,
it's the name of the show. Essentially, yeah.
And you know, and that's, you know, I don't know. I try to stay on the irony roller coaster, but that one threw me off at the curve. I mean, it's like, you know, I guess I have an old-fashioned passion for looking at things, and I don't think it really needs to be mentioned, but evidently it does now.
What did you also feel it's not the most congenial space for seeing things?
It seemed to me an undistinguished space. I mean, years ago when a museum in California and Los Angeles did the Temporary Contemporary, they took a raw space and they did something interesting with it. And I don't think this is a particularly interesting space. I mean, yes, it is very interesting to see Demoiselles d'Avignon in a warehouse situation, and it looks a little different, to be sure. I mean, who would have thought that you would have Picasso's prostitutes hanging out in Queen Street corner? But that's a certain fascination with that. But it seems that no one had much fun or took many chances with that space. I'm sure it could have been a more interesting space. And it has a kind of Whitney biennial feel. That the Tempo show there has.
There's a show called Tempo, which is I won't burden either of you with actually having to describe it, but it's a whole bunch of contemporary work of different sorts by lots of different artists. It's hard to describe. There are also some cars on view, aren't there?
Yes, that's the sexiest part of the show, as I think you said in your piece. I mean, they're absolutely beautiful, and it's better than Sex in the City. It's fabulous. These automobiles. But the general air of it just seemed to me sort of heavy and not enjoyable, not about pleasure.
Is there something going on in museums? I'll let you re-enter this, Rob, if you wish. I mean, because Peter, you say, this idea of appealing to yuppies and a place to hang out. I mean, there's a lot of talk all the time, and it's been going on for years, probably for generations, about museums becoming, too popular or having too many things going on, too many restaurants or things. I mean, is there something that's particular to this moment about museums? Have they become more commercial, or is this just a perpetual complaint? Or Elizabeth?
I think there's something going on that I have to say, and I feel like an old fogey, but I really don't like it. And I got it sort of clarified in my mind what it was with the Biennial, which is the show at the Whitney that I usually love it. It's so much fun. It's just raggedy-taggedy. And
that was this spring.
This spring. At this time, and I think this is maybe what you're talking about at MoMA too, or there was this feeling of an absolute lack of a kind of a structure and a form. There was no arrangement somehow. It felt like the curator had the best intentions in the world. He wanted to really do what the Whitney Biennial is supposed to do, go get all these young folks and give them a chance and put the work together. And then he didn't pull it together. You didn't know what you were looking at, and it did feel like it was sort of a holding pen for yuppies to come and
everything is soundbite.
See all this weird stuff. Everything was just right. And to me, it didn't do the art. It wasn't in service of the art. It was in service of this kind of idea where the museum would kind of like leak out into the public, and with nobody was getting any help there. The artists weren't getting any help, and then the yuppies weren't getting any help either, which would get them to look.
So lots to read.
Tons to read. I hate all the text. It's as though you can't just go in and look anymore. You have to read something, and that's been going on for a long time.
Not in every show. Rob's Richter show was wonderful for having
Right.
very
Total
little
absence,
way
yes.
of text.
That was a relief.
And what's the point of all this text?
I think one thing, this is not by way of defense of my colleagues or myself for that matter, but I think there's been a lot of discussion about the institutional problems of museums, which are many and which are some of them quite aggravated. But most of that discussion is about money, about infrastructure, about a whole lot of other things. But there's been very little discussion, and you raise it, I think, about what the form of museums are. A museum is a form, like anything else, an essay or a treatise or what have you. Literary forms exist, and there are forms of exhibition as well, and they're getting either done badly so that you can't recognize them, or blurred in such a way that you can't see that this exhibition was made to be experienced in a certain way, and this other, which may be quite opposite in style, was made to be experienced in another way. And I think there are many factors, but for example, some exhibitions are simply something where you show people a variety of things in combination, and you trust that the average person is actually pretty intelligent after all, and if you show them in a way which allows them to digest it themselves, a lot can happen. In other cases, the material itself requires explanation. I'm not averse to wall labels, but I'm averse to wall labels next to things that any damn fool can see what it is. What you want to do is enjoy it and get deeply involved in it, and that's I think a lot of what we see are the breakdown of that sense of the genres of exhibition or the genres of museum show, and I would love to see somebody take that on rather than telling us what we already know an awful lot about, which is the way power games are played inside museums.
The noise level is also remarkable. I mean, you can't find a quiet spot in a museum increasingly, because understandably, some object is talking to you or shouting, and I don't know what curators are supposed to do about that.
Well, I'll tell you, I've worked very happily with some people who make those things in the sense that they're terrific people, but I remember...
You're talking now, just to be clear...
Acoustic guides.
Noisy installation.
You're talking about noisy art
Yes.
and noisy acoustic guides.
Noisy art, but acoustic guides are
Video
also
installations and acoustic guides,
In a particular case, I made an exhibition where there were 8 objects arranged in sequence along the wall. And those 8 objects, without being didactic at all, actually introduced people to a series of visual experiences which were all correlated. The requirement of the acoustic guide was to speak about the first and the last. And what you are doing as the voice is saying, skip all that other stuff, go from here to there. And I think that acoustic guides are very useful for some things, but they are also very, very much preemptive of visual experience, visual exploration, and so on.
You can't listen and look at the same time with equal...
But the other thing is that museums should not be quiet places. They ought to be places where people, like in the old salons in France, stand up in front of paintings and argue about what they are, whether they're good, what they're bad, what they mean. They're not temples, and we shouldn't be hushed when we're there.
But Mark, I think, is saying, I don't mean to speak for him, that some of the art itself is very loud, but also that it demands that you stand in front of it for a certain period of time. A 30-minute video expects you to sit in a room for so long and watch it. I mean, is this part of it?
There's a curatorial problem if you have a Bruce Nauman, say, which is now a terrific Nauman at MoMA Queens, putting a very aggressive, angry sound out there, and then very close by there's a Rothko. I think it's an interesting disjunction, I suppose, but it's very hard to look at paintings, or at least I find it hard to look at paintings when Bruce Nauman is this in my ear.
I want to thank you all. It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thank you.